So as we look at God's covenant, I actually had to back up a little bit and talk about before time began, and we'll touch on that a little bit. But as we look at these covenants, we have the covenant with creation. It's going to be all the laws of heavens and earth and physics. We see the covenant with Adam, and of course that had one law, and that's Hosea 6 verse 7, saying, just like Israel, just like Adam, they transgressed my covenant. Covenant with Noah, that's a covenant of promise. We'll talk about covenant of promise versus law. So we have, well, that's not working.
Trying to get fancy here and it messes it up. Yeah, that should be it.
All right. Thank you, man. Mark has spent a lot of work making certain that the network would handle this, so we thank God for Mark, and I don't think we understand how blessed we are to have a sound room that is able to. They were actually prepared when all the COVID broke out to do streaming and has kept up with things so well. We have the covenant of Noah, and that covenant covers chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9 of Genesis. And as we look at that covenant, and we think about who that promise was made to, that promise was a covenant of promise. God bound himself that he would never destroy the earth again. The covenant was actually made with all creation, all critters, all humans. That covenant actually is a covenant that benefits all atheists and all squirrels and all critters of the earth, because that's who God made that covenant with. And the sign of that covenant's a rainbow. We have the covenant with Abraham, and our promise from our covenant goes back to the covenant with Abraham. We have the covenant with Israel, which is a covenant of law. The covenant with David, which is a covenant of promise, which is that there would be an everlasting kingdom that would follow through his descendants, and that someone would be on that throne who is Jesus Christ. And we have our new covenant, and we have the new covenant that we have with God. So that puts things a little bit into perspective. The new covenant obsoleted the covenant with Sinai, but has ties back to Genesis, ties back to the covenant with Abraham, because the covenant with Abraham in chapter 12, about verse 3, it says all the nations of the earth would be blessed through your offspring. That's repeated again in Genesis 12. Probably about verse 3, and then it's repeated again in Genesis 15. And then if we would go over to Galatians 3, about verse 8, it says that statement that all the nations of the world would be blessed through Abraham's offspring, it's actually Abram's offspring at that time, that was proclaiming the gospel in advance. And that's why Acts 2 verse 29 speaks of the promise. Ephesians 2 verse 12 speaks of the covenant. We were strangers to the covenant of promise. So we'll look at all of that, but hopefully that gives us a little bit of an overview, and that was one of the things that I was asked to be sure that I put everything into perspective where we were. We talked about the Greek. Well, there's your Ephesians 2:12. And this is your covenant with God. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenant of promise, having no hope You're either in covenant with God or you're not in covenant with God. It's binary. If you're in covenant, it means life. If you're not in covenant, it means no hope. Hopeless and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace. Again, that's why I keep referring to covenants as a treaty, because a treaty is designed to bring peace. And of course, that's the covenant of reconciliation, which brings us back into harmony with God. So here was one of the things that came in. We need to fully understand covenant, the meaning, and relationship. And so I want to touch on that a little bit before we just jump into a covenant. I'd prefer to, it'd be good to just jump into the one with Abraham, but I think this will help. There are two kinds of promises that we will see that God makes. One is a covenant of promise and one is a covenant of law. We've already talked about the covenants of law. Do you remember which ones those are? What about creation? I mean, that one's pretty straightforward. The laws of heavens and earth, all the laws of physics, gravity. Just think about the last time you fell out of a tree. Was gravity a respecter of persons? No, you didn't float up. You didn't break that covenant, you broke yourself. So the covenant with creation is going to be a covenant of law. The covenant with Noah, that was actually a covenant in chapter 9 of Genesis, was a covenant with all creation, all the creatures on the earth. And so that was a covenant of promise. We have the covenant with Abraham. That was a covenant of promise. Covenant with Sinai with Israel. It's a covenant of law. And we'll look at the 10 Commandments tonight a little bit. So we have a covenant of promise and a covenant of law. I think a beautiful example of the covenant of promise is when in Genesis 15, when God committed to the promise that he had made with Abraham, that all of it's actually Abram. I got corrected on that in Bible Bowl here a couple of Sunday nights ago. I said, where is the topic, the call of Abraham? And, one of the little girls raised her hand and she says, that is not in the Bible. And I'm like, oh, man. I was looking for an answer of Genesis chapter 12, and I love working with them. She said the name Abraham didn't exist until Genesis 17, and so it's the call of Abram. So I probably better try to be a little bit precise. I don't think y'all will be quite as critical as, a third grader, but... The other, that was a Genesis chapter 15. That was a covenant of promise, and God bound himself to that promise when he went down between the pieces. And in the last two verses, Genesis chapter 15, it said, on that day, God established a covenant with Abram. So we have... God imposes an obligation on himself. We receive the blessings, but do not have an obligation. Certainly, we are to live in faith, and we'll look at that as when we get into ours. But and to our covenant, God's covenant with us is the way I should frame that. Covenant, and what I put in here was imposes an obligation on himself. A good example of that is Genesis 9. That's covenant with Noah. So we have a covenant of law, legal obligation with blessings for adherence and curses for breach of covenant. And so that has terms, and so that covenant would have terms that would be set by God. All right, there are a couple of flavors of covenants. I don't know how you would say this best, but and I'm not big on big words, but suzerainty, covenant or treaty. What that really means is that someone who is supreme, like a king, sets the terms for a covenant, and the vassals either accept or reject that covenant. And if they accept it, it usually means life, and if they don't accept it, it usually means death. So suzerainty just means that God, as supreme, defines the terms of the covenant, and there is no negotiation or bargaining. We can accept or reject the terms of the covenant, but it is always on God's terms. God never makes a parity covenant. A parity covenant would be, I guess, I've got Genesis 21 here. That's the Treaty of Beersheba. That's where Abram and Abimelech came together and said, Abimelech said, hey, you're growing in so much power that we really want to make a treaty with you. And it was called a covenant. And so they both accepted the terms that they would live peacefully, and there were some squabbles over some water holes. But anyway, that's an example of a treaty. Marriage, what about marriage? Well, I know for Nancy and I, both of us set our vows. We both made a commitment to each other, and so that would be a covenant of parity, equal. We both committed to each other. God always sets the terms of the covenant. In fact, what about the terms of the covenant with Israel? This is 10 Commandments. You recognize them. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them, for I am the Lord your God. I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to the thousands of those who love and keep my commandments. Does that sound like negotiation? So when we look at this, it's important for us to understand that God, as supreme, will always set the terms of the covenant. There's no negotiation. You will find times when Moses, because let's what about Genesis? What about Genesis 18? That's really Abraham, because it's after 17. Abraham was pleading for Sodom. He wanted Lot to live, right? And so he was pleading for Sodom, and he was pleading. We often express our desires to God in our prayers, and that is because we are in covenant with God. But the establishment of the covenant and the terms of the covenant are always set by God. And how do you like the one here? I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Wow, I thought jealousy was bad. Don't you remember that's kind of in the roll call of sins, a monster that consumes you? Well, it's important for us to understand that as we get further into this, we will see that some of covenant terminology, let's just follow that thought just a little bit. I am a jealous God. Take care lest you make a covenant with the... This is God speaking to the Israelites. Remember in chapter 20 we had the 10 commandments. Now we're up to chapter 34. And so God is saying, take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their Asherim. That's the idol worship that was going on. So God is requiring that the children of Israel be faithful. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God. Wow, it's one thing to say God is jealous, but it's a whole other thing to say that's my name. Kana is the word that is used in the Hebrew. Wow. We like to call God Jehovah. We don't hear anybody calling him Kana, do we? My name is jealous. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited, you eat of his sacrifice. And you take of your daughters, and you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, and make your sons whore after their gods. You see, when we're in covenant with God, God expects faithfulness. And as we go through this, we'll see that God's covenants are often referred to in perspective with the covenant of marriage. And so it's important for us to understand that jealousy, that a covenant, there are certain things that are exclusive in a covenant. In a covenant of marriage, there are certain things that are absolutely exclusive, that God expects to be exclusive. Otherwise, there would never be a discussion of adultery. And one thing that is absolutely exclusive in marriage that is expected is that we be faithful and not be adulterous. And so as we look at this, we see this in perspective that when God said, I am a jealous God, he is referring to those who would go after other gods, which we will see is discussed as spiritual adultery. And if you want to see more about spiritual adultery, sometime go read Jeremiah 3 and count how many times the word divorce, whore, are referred to in that chapter. That's spiritual adultery. So this helps us to see that there are certain things that are exclusive from the perspective of the covenant of marriage. But anything outside of that covenant of marriage from the perspective of adultery are not things that are exclusive. And so those are not things that, those are things that jealousy is completely out of bounds for. So here we see God speaking of his jealousy for those who would choose to seek after other gods. And I think down here at the bottom, you shall not make for yourself any gods of cast metal. So this is again faithfulness. Are we good with that? So all of the covenants that God establishes are going to be established on his terms, and you can accept them and live, or you can reject them. And most of the rejections are a spiritual or physical death. We good with that? I love you, man. And I just lost my place, didn't I? All right, we have a covenant process, and not too much on processes from the standpoint of spiritual things. So, but we're gonna go through this just because we need to understand the different aspects of a covenant. I don't particularly like these words, but I don't know that we have a better one. There's an introduction. God announces that he's the author of the covenant. He comes on the scene. I am the Lord your God. Then we have the preamble. That's kind of the loving kindness we talked about, which was said. Kind things the king has done to you. In fact, in the covenant with Sinai, God said, I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt, took you through the sea, parted the waters. And so we'll see that we have God expressing the kind things he has done. We'll see the invitation to be in covenant. I actually do love the Matthew 11 because that is God's invitation to us. Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I'm meek and gentle in heart, and you will find rest unto your soul. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's a beautiful invitation that God has given us. And I think as we look at the prologue, I think all of the Gospels fall into that. I think the Matthew 11 is really emphasizing the invitation. We have terms of the covenant, that stipulations, working rules of the covenant. Covenant can come with blessings and curses. When Adam and Eve broke the covenant that God had, don't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. One thing you don't want is you don't want the knowledge of evil. You want to run from it. They now have the knowledge of good and evil. What are the curses that were associated with that? Well, what about the curse on the serpent? He was going to sliver on his belly for the rest of his life. Now, I've always been curious. Maybe I'll find out in the world to come. Apologize, I don't know how he got around before that. Anyway, we have blessings and curses. What was the curse on Adam? Man, I should say. God said, cursed. Yeah, the ground's not going to work for you, and there's some words in there called thorns and thistles. Now, I got caught again with the class on Bible Bowl. I'd said, well, what's the curse on the woman? What did God say the curse was to the woman? And of course, I wanted them to say, well, it is the pains in childbearing. Interesting, God did not say that there would be a curse to the woman at all. So if you read that verse, it's interesting. God never called that a curse. He said, cursed be the Satan and cursed be man. Never did say cursed. Well, it's always nice when you have some young ones that can help you look at things in a very precise way. But anyway, there are blessings and curses. We have the oath swearing. This is a little interesting here. Hebrews, I know Dave's gonna get us here, and I love the fact that some of the things overlap. That when we get to talking about the new covenant, this actually is talking about the covenant with Abraham. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, "Surely I will bless you and multiply you." And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor for the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. That anchor, you see that inner place behind the curtain? That's covenant terminology. Because as we get over into in Hebrews 8, 9, and 10, we will find that the new covenant was established on the death of Christ, and we'll see the word covenant, testament used there quite often. And that's exactly when the curtain of the temple was ripped from top to bottom, which then gave us access to our great high priest, Jesus Christ. So we have oath swearing. God swore by himself because there was no one greater. Oftentimes, a covenant will come with a name change. And do we remember what chapter Abram changed to Abraham? Well, it's going to be Genesis 17. And who else's name changed? Yeah, Sarah. And then we have Israel. We'll talk about that as we talk about a little bit on the covenant that God had with Jacob. What about Paul? What was his name before Saul? Yeah, so we see a name change. What is your name change? Yeah, Christian. Yeah, exactly. Acts 11. That's really good. And then I think, give me Acts 26 as well. Do you think that you're going to convince me to be that was Agrippa, right? A Christian in such short a time. And so we see the reference to the name change. What about the storage of the covenant? Well, what about the storage of the covenant with Sinai, Israel? Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant. And so the Ark of the Covenant contained some manna, Aaron's staff, and the stone tablets. And what about your covenant with God? Where is it stored? Stored in your heart. And we'll see that as we get to Jeremiah 31. We have witnesses to the covenant. We have covenant renewal. Actually, I need to change that to covenant remembrance, because I think that's really a better terminology. And so your covenant with God, when is your covenant remembrance? Yeah, every Sunday morning we have the Lord's Supper. And so Jesus said in Matthew 26:28, we read that so often, this is the new covenant in my blood poured out for many. So then we have the sign of the covenant. The sign of the covenant with Abraham was circumcision. The sign of the covenant with Israel is keeping the Sabbath. And the sign of your covenant with God, His Spirit within you. And so that's how you recognized as your sheep on the day of judgment. Oh man, I did it again. And I mentioned earlier that the covenant God so often refers when He is addressing His covenants with us as a covenant of marriage, which is something that He wants us to understand. So all of these processes, all of this fits nicely into the covenant of marriage. I think we're all familiar with this one. I want you to look down here at the bottom before we read. Oh man, I wished I hadn't done that. Sorry. But I am talking about Christ and the church. So I want you to understand that we always read this from the perspective of husbands, love your wives, and that's a given. But this section is specifically to address, just think about Ephesians as talking about the glory of the church that belongs to Christ, right? So let's just read that. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love wives as their own bodies. Wow, that's humbling. That means as a husband, you are always to stand between danger and your wife, right? And so this is really humbling. But if you look at this, you have to love the way Christ presented to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with the water through the blood, through the word. And then he goes on to say, he who loves his wife loves himself. Well, we remember in Genesis 1, probably about 24, that the man would leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two would become one flesh. So that's part of covenant terminology. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it just as Christ does a church, for we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. I didn't even need to go over to Genesis for that. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. That's Ephesians, the glory of the church, the body of Christ. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So this is covenant terminology when we talk about being one. And so you'll oftentimes see marriage referred to in perspective with God's relationship with us. Do you see that here? We're good. And we already, I think, went through Genesis 2:24. Now this is actually about your covenant. And you can always tell whether You can always tell whether an Old Testament, the meaning of an Old Testament prophecy, especially if it's quoted in the New Testament. So this one happens to be quoted twice, once in Hebrews, well, it's several times, but in Hebrews, it's in Hebrews 8 and 10. This is talking about your new covenant. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. Do you see the relationship there? Do you see that God is relational? Do you see him referring to his relationship with Israel as a husband? And you also see that one thing that is exclusive in that covenant we've already talked about was that you didn't go after other gods. You didn't abandon God, divorce him, and go after other gods. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts. That's where it's stored. That's where your covenant is stored. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. I really love that because that's relational. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And that's really beautiful because when we think about the fact that because of Christ we can be children of God, we can be his people. And of course, as Galatians 3:26 and 27, which we've been over several times. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall know me. From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Isn't that beautiful? That's really speaking and prophesying the forgiveness through the forgiving blood of Christ. And you'll see that as we get Sunday morning, as Dave gets closer to this quote in Hebrews. And I mentioned Jeremiah 3. This one's a little rough, so we probably won't read a whole lot of it. If a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's wife, will he return to her? Would not that land be greatly polluted? That's talking about her. You have played the whore with many lovers, and would you return to me, declares the Lord? This is Jeremiah speaking to Israel. Lift up your eyes to the bare heights and see where have you not been ravished. By the wayside you have set awaiting lovers. Like an Arab in the wilderness, you have polluted the land with your vile whoredom. Therefore the showers have been withheld and the spring rain has not come. Yet you have the forehead of a whore. You refuse to be ashamed. Have you not just now called me my father? You are the friend of my youth. Anyway, it goes on, and it's very expressive from the standpoint of the Israel abandoning God and going after idols and other gods, and abandoning the covenant that God had established with them. So when we look at this from the covenant of marriage, I would normally just choose someone, but and just ask them if they can remember the first time they were introduced to their wife. And I do. I mean, I remember when Nancy and I were both working. I was working as a night shift as a computer operator, and she was working as a key tape operator, and that was paper tape, which is, I think, before everybody's time in here. And one of the ladies there, Flo Good, invited us to her house. I don't think Nancy and I knew how to say much to each other. I was a little bit too shy too, and she didn't talk a whole lot. We have the prologue, which is dating, and so we dated for probably about a year. The invitation, I won't. That's going to be the proposal, and I think I would let Nancy tell you about that. I don't think I was. I don't think that I was real suave about it. The terms of the covenant, Nancy and I both said our vows. It was a covenant of parity. I made my promises. She made her promises. So we had the terms of the covenant, the oath swearing, ratification. That's when we said the vows to each other. And then I guess there was a point in time when we were not in covenant and a point in time when we were. At what point in time were we in covenant? Well, I always thought it was when I said I do, but somebody corrected me and said, well, it's when when the preacher says, I now introduce you as man and wife. Anyway, we have the ceremonies after ratification. That would have been a rehearsal. I'm sorry, that would have been after the wedding, and actually we didn't do that. We went and moved into an apartment. We didn't. We just had Nancy's family there, and they sent us on our way, and so we didn't have the dinner after. We didn't have the gathering after, or ceremony after our wedding. Where people do. Anyway, name change. Well, Nancy was a McCoy, and she was willing to be a Walker. So we had a name change. So do you see this process? How about the storage of a covenant? Well, I know there's two places where our covenant is stored of marriage. One is down in the basement of the City Hall at Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it's in a file cabinet and labeled 1973. So if you think about that, we've got a marriage license there. They've probably scanned it in by now, but I've got ours in the gun cabinet, so it is locked up. The sign of the covenant. Well, yeah, you're right. This says that I belong to Nancy. So we have the sign of the covenant. Well, when we look at this covenant, it's kind of easy for us to see why God would refer to the covenant of marriage so often when he speaks of the covenant that he has with us. Covenant remembrance. When's the last time you forgot your anniversary? Didn't work out very well, did it? So, our covenant remembrance, as Steve said, is the Lord's Supper. And we have blessings of being in covenant, and I certainly am blessed. And so we see a reference here. We see, as we look through that process, that it actually makes sense that the covenant of marriage would often be referred to by God, especially if the church is called the bride of Christ. And in Ephesians, the glory of the church, the body of Christ. In fact, I think Ephesians, what is it, 2:19 is your access to the wireless internet here, which says that we're all part of the household of God. And that's why, God is relational. He has also set us into a situation, has set us into a family where we're relational. And just think about, from the perspective of relational, we all would like to just go off in a corner somewhere and think spiritual thoughts and hope that was, and hope that we could just be spiritual. And that's not what God designed for the church. He designed us to encourage each other, be brothers and sisters, love each other. And I love you, and I've already gone over time. We really will get to the covenant of creation next